At 2:47 a.m., while my husband lay in his mistress's bed, our 6-year-old daughter flatlined on the operating table. I called him 17 times. 17. He silenced every single one. The last words Emma whispered before surgery were, "Tell Daddy I love him." She almost died loving a man who chose another woman over her life. But my father, a retired federal prosecutor who spent 30 years putting criminals behind bars, when he discovered what Derek did, he didn't just get angry. He got evidence. What happened in that courtroom left everyone speechless. Stay until the end. You won't believe how this family got their justice. Drop a comment telling me what would you have done. The grandfather clock had just chimed 9 when Caroline Ashford Mercer closed the worn copy of Charlotte's Web and looked down at her daughter's peaceful face. Emma's blonde curls spread across the pillow like spun gold, her 6-year-old cheeks still holding the rosy flush of her evening bath. Carolyn brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead, feeling the fierce surge of love that motherhood had brought into her life. These quiet moments were her favorite part of each day. "Mommy, do you think Charlotte is in heaven?" Emma's sleepy voice broke the silence. Carolyn had spent 12 years as a pediatric oncology nurse at Boston Children's Hospital, learning that children understood far more about life and death than adults credited them. "I think Charlotte is wherever love goes when it becomes too big for one body to hold," she answered softly. Emma seemed satisfied and let her eyes close, drifting toward sleep. The house was quiet except for the distant hum of the refrigerator. Derek had called earlier to say he would be late, something about a client dinner in Providence. Caroline had stopped questioning his excuses months ago, telling herself that successful men had demanding careers. The first sign that something was wrong came at 11:47. Caroline heard a wet, gasping sound from upstairs that made her blood run cold. Her feet carried her up the stairs 2 at a time with the instincts of both mother and medical professional. When she burst through Emma's doorway, what she saw stopped her heart completely. Emma was sitting up in bed, small hands clawing at her throat, her face a terrifying shade of purple. Hives erupted across her skin in angry red welts, spreading with horrifying speed. "Mommy," Emma wheezed, the word barely escaping her swelling throat. Carolyn grabbed the EpiPen from the nightstand drawer and drove it into her daughter's thigh without hesitation. "You're okay, baby. Mommy's here." She dialed 911 while holding Emma upright. "Severe anaphylaxis," she reported, 6 years old. EpiPen administered. Her daughter's breathing was not improving, which meant this reaction was far worse than anything they had encountered before. Caroline's thumb found Derek's contact. The phone rang 3 times before clicking to voicemail. "Derek, it's Emma. She's having a severe allergic reaction. Call me back immediately." She dialed again and voicemail. A third time. Voicemail. The fourth call went unanswered as sirens grew in the distance. Where was he? The paramedics burst through the front door at 12:03. Anaphylaxis, unknown trigger. EpiPen administered 14 minutes ago. No improvement. Carolyn reported as they placed Emma on the stretcher. In the ambulance, she continued calling Derek's phone every 90 seconds while watching the monitors track her daughter's failing vital signs. Emma's oxygen levels hovered dangerously in the mid-80s. "Tell Daddy," Emma whispered suddenly, barely audible over the siren. "Tell Daddy what, sweetheart?" Caroline leaned closer, pressing her ear to her daughter's blue-tinged lips. "Tell Daddy I love him." The words came out in a single painful breath before Emma's eyes rolled back and the monitors began to scream their alarm. Boston Children's Hospital emerged from the darkness like a beacon. Dr. Robert Matthews recognized Caroline immediately. "We're taking her straight to Trauma Room 1. You need to stay in the waiting room." The waiting room became a purgatory of plastic chairs and flickering fluorescent lights. 17 calls to Derek's phone, 17 times hearing his cheerful voicemail, 17 moments of abandonment that she would never forget. The clock showed 2:47 when a doctor pushed through the trauma room doors. "Your daughter went into cardiac arrest approximately 20 minutes ago. We performed CPR for 47 seconds before restoring normal rhythm." Carolyn heard herself asking questions, but the words floated around her like scattered leaves. Emma was alive, damaged and traumatized, but alive. She was allowed into the PCU at 3:15, finding her daughter impossibly small in a bed surrounded by beeping machines. Emma's face was still swollen, her lips cracked, her small chest rising with supplemental oxygen. Caroline pulled a chair close and took her daughter's cold hand. "Mommy's here. Mommy's never leaving. I promise." At 4:30, Derek appeared in the doorway looking disheveled. "Oh my God, Caroline, I just got your messages. My phone died during the client dinner." He rushed to the bedside, his face arranging into perfect paternal concern. Too perfect, Carolyn thought, like a performance he had practiced. Her heart stopped, Carolyn said flatly. For 47 seconds. I called you 17 times. Derek pulled her into an embrace that should have felt comforting. Instead, she smelled something that made her blood turn to ice. Jasmine and vanilla. A perfume she did not recognize. She had worn the same fragrance for 8 years. This was something entirely different. Something heavier and more sensual. She pulled back slowly, eyes traveling to his collar where a smear of burgundy lipstick caught her attention, a shade she would never wear. "Derek, where were you really tonight?" He blinked, and something calculating flickered behind his eyes before vanishing. "The client dinner ran late. You know how demanding these Boston clients can be." As morning light crept through the hospital windows, Carolyn made a silent vow. She would find out the truth about where her husband had been while their daughter lay dying. She would discover why he had ignored 17 phone calls, why he arrived smelling of another woman's perfume, why his alibi felt manufactured like a movie script. Her father's text arrived just after midnight. "Just landed in Boston. Don't say anything to anyone until I get there." Richard Ashford had spent 30 years as a federal prosecutor. If there was one thing he knew how to spot, it was a liar. Caroline sat by Emma's bed through the long hours of night, watching her daughter breathe and planning her next move. Derek had made his choice on the night of Emma's emergency. Now Caroline would make hers. The man sleeping in the recliner by the window thought he had gotten away with something. He had no idea that his wife had just declared war, and she would not stop until she had the truth. Emma was improving rapidly over the 5 days following her emergency, the remarkable resilience of childhood proving itself once again as color returned to her cheeks and strength to her voice. She was sitting up now, coloring in a book that one of the nurses had brought her as a get-well gift, occasionally glancing at the television mounted in the corner where cartoons played on an endless cheerful loop. Derek had positioned himself in the chair closest to the window, his laptop open on the small table beside him, and his phone constantly buzzing with messages that he answered with the grave expression of a man conducting matters of tremendous importance. Carolyn watched his performance with new eyes that saw through every gesture, every carefully chosen word, every calculated display of fatherly devotion. Richard Ashford arrived at precisely 10 in the morning on the third day of Emma's hospital stay, his tall frame filling the doorway in a way that commanded immediate attention from everyone in the room. At 67 years old, Caroline's father still carried himself with the bearing of a man who had spent 3 decades facing down murderers and crime bosses in federal courtrooms. His silver hair immaculately combed despite his overnight journey, and his blue eyes sharp with an intelligence that age had not dimmed in the slightest. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and his leather briefcase hung at his side like a weapon waiting to be drawn at the right moment. Grandpa, Emma's face lit up with pure, uncomplicated joy, and she extended her thin arms for a hug that Richard delivered with surprising gentleness for such an imposing man. Carolyn watched her father interact with her daughter and felt the familiar twist of love and gratitude that had defined their relationship since her mother's death from breast cancer 15 years ago. Richard Ashford might have been terrifying in a courtroom, capable of reducing hardened criminals to stammering wrecks with nothing but his questions and his steely gaze. But with his granddaughter, he was pure softness and unconditional devotion. He produced a small stuffed elephant from his briefcase, explaining that he had found it at the airport gift shop during his layover and immediately thought that Emma might need a friend during her hospital stay. Emma clutched the toy immediately against her chest and declared with 6-year-old certainty that his name would be Gerald. Derek rose from his chair and extended his hand toward Richard with the smooth confidence of a man greeting an old friend rather than the father of the wife he had betrayed. His smile was broad and open and welcoming, his posture relaxed and assured, every element of his presentation carefully calibrated to project the image of a devoted husband who had nothing whatsoever to hide. "Richard, thank you so much for coming all this way. It's been an absolutely terrifying few days, but our little fighter here is pulling through beautifully." Carolyn noted how effortlessly the words flowed from her husband's lips, how seamlessly he projected the image of a man who had been present through every moment of his daughter's crisis. Richard shook Derek's hand with a grip that lingered perhaps a moment longer than necessary. his eyes conducting the kind of assessment that had made him legendary in prosecutorial circles across the entire state. "I came as soon as I heard the news about my granddaughter," Richard said, his voice revealing nothing of whatever calculations were running behind his sharp blue eyes. "Where were you when it happened?" "Derek." The question hung in the air between them like a blade balanced on its edge. Casual enough in its delivery, but carrying devastation in its implications. Derek's practiced smile flickered almost imperceptibly, a microsecond of adjustment that Carolyn caught only because she was watching for exactly such a tell. His recovery was smooth and immediate, the mask settling back into place with the ease of long practice. "Client dinner in Providence," Derek explained, his tone hitting exactly the right notes of apologetic and frustrated. "My phone died at some point during the evening, and I didn't realize it until I got home and found the house empty and dark. It was the worst night of my entire life. Richard, I'll never forgive myself for not being there when Caroline needed me most." Richard nodded slowly, his expression revealing absolutely nothing of his thoughts, giving Derek no feedback whatsoever about whether his story was being believed or doubted. "Providence is quite a drive for a weeknight dinner. Must have been an important client to warrant that kind of investment." Derek launched into an elaborate explanation about investment portfolios and high net worth individuals and the demanding nature of managing significant wealth, his words tumbling out with perhaps just a bit too much enthusiasm and detail for a man with nothing to hide. Victoria Mercer arrived at noon with an armful of expensive flowers and a presence that somehow made the already small PICU room feel even more cramped and oppressive. Derek's mother was a formidable woman of 64, her silver hair styled in an elegant bob that probably required $200 and 3 hours at a salon to maintain. Her designer clothes to telegraphing generational wealth with every precisely chosen accessory. She swept toward Emma's bed with an expression of practiced concern, her voice carrying the slight Boston Brahmin accent that marked her as old money from the moment she opened her mouth. "My darling girl," she cooed, leaning in to press a careful kiss against Emma's forehead. "Grandmother was so terribly worried about you." Caroline exchanged a meaningful glance with her father and saw her own skepticism reflected clearly in his sharp eyes. Victoria had never been particularly warm toward her granddaughter during the 6 years of Emma's life, preferring to send expensive gifts on birthdays and holidays rather than spend actual time in the child's company. Her dramatic appearance here in the hospital felt like another performance, a display designed to project the image of a concerned family matriarch for whoever might be watching, rather than genuine emotion for a child she barely knew. Richard stood and offered Victoria his hand with the courtly manners of his generation, but Carolyn noticed that his greeting was notably cooler than the warmth he had shown Emma just minutes before. "Victoria, always a pleasure to see you," Richard said, the words polite but carrying an undertone that only someone who knew him well would detect. "I understand you flew in from Maine quite early this morning. Such dedication to family is admirable." Victoria's smile was a masterpiece of social grace that revealed absolutely nothing of whatever she might actually be thinking or feeling beneath her perfectly maintained surface. Derek stepped out around 3 in the afternoon, explaining that he had an urgent work call that simply could not wait even a few more minutes. Carolyn watched him walk toward the elevator bank, watched him pull out his phone before he had even reached the doors, watched his entire face transform into something softer and more animated and more alive as he connected with whoever was waiting on the other end of that call. Through the window of the waiting room, she could see him pacing back and forth and smiling broadly and gesturing with the energy of a man conducting a very different kind of conversation than a stressful work call about investment portfolios. Richard appeared at Caroline's elbow without making a sound, his presence solid and reassuring like a wall she could lean against. "He's not talking to a client," her father said quietly, stating the obvious truth in a way that demanded acknowledgement rather than continued denial. Carolyn nodded slowly, her eyes still tracking her husband's animated movements through the glass. "I know," she whispered, the admission feeling like a weight being lifted and added simultaneously. "I've known for a while now, I think. I just didn't want to see what was right in front of my face." Richard's hand found her shoulder and squeezed with gentle pressure that communicated volumes without words. "Come to my house tomorrow evening, after Emma is settled and asleep. There are things we need to discuss, and this hospital room is not the appropriate place for that conversation." That night, after Victoria had departed in a cloud of expensive perfume and Derek had announced that he needed to go home for a shower and some proper sleep, Carolyn sat alone beside her daughter's bed and navigated to their shared cell phone account on her phone. The records loaded slowly on the hospital's overtaxed Wi-Fi system, but when they finally appeared on her screen, they confirmed everything she had suspected and feared. Derek's phone had not been dead on the night of Emma's emergency. It had been in active use, sending and receiving calls and texts throughout the entire evening while their daughter lay dying. At 2 in the morning, precisely when Emma's heart had stopped beating on the operating table, Derek had been on a phone call that lasted 47 minutes, the exact same duration that medical staff had been fighting desperately to restart their daughter's heart. The coincidence felt like a knife sliding between her ribs. She scrolled further back through the records with trembling fingers, finding a pattern that made her stomach turn with nausea. Hundreds of calls and texts to the same unfamiliar number, stretching back 18 months into the past. Long calls late at night when Derek claimed to be working overtime at the office. Text messages exchanged throughout the day, including during times when he was supposedly in client meetings or business lunches. The volume and frequency painted a picture that required no interpretation, no benefit of the doubt, no alternative explanation. Her husband was having an affair and had been conducting it for well over a year. He had not simply missed her desperate calls on the night of Emma's emergency. He had seen them lighting up his screen and consciously chosen not to answer. He had allowed their daughter to die alone while he whispered sweet nothings to another woman. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of understanding exactly what her husband had done and exactly what she was going to do about it. Tonight, why, she would stay by her daughter's side and stand guard over the only thing that truly mattered in her shattered world. Derek Mercer had made his choice on the night of Emma's emergency, and now Caroline would make hers in response. The drive to her father's house in Beacon Hill took Caroline through streets she had known her entire life. Emma was safely at home with Maria babysitting. Derek was conveniently absent, attending an important dinner with a potential client. The lie was so smooth that Caroline had simply nodded and wished him luck. Let him dig his own grave, she thought. She would be the one holding the shovel. Richard's townhouse sat on Mount Vernon Street, its red brick facade projecting old Boston elegance. Caroline had grown up here, learning to read in the leather-scented study where her father still spent most of his time. The door opened before she could knock, and Richard's expression made her heart sink further. "Come to the study," he said, leading her through the hallway. He opened a drawer in his mahogany desk and pulled out a thick folder. "I hired a private investigator 2 months ago. I suspected something was wrong in your marriage." He paused, his blue eyes meeting hers with steady intensity. "After what happened with Emma, I can't stay silent anymore." Carolyn reached for the folder with trembling hands. Inside, she found photographs that confirmed her worst fears and exceeded them. Derek at intimate restaurants with a young blonde woman. Derek entering an apartment building in Back Bay. Derek and the woman at a hotel in New York, checking in together. The photograph stretched back 18 months. "Her name is Natalie Blackwell," Richard said. "She's 29, a junior analyst at Whitmore & Associates. The affair began about 18 months ago." He handed Carolyn a printed profile showing a beautiful woman with highlighted hair and an expensive smile. The phone records show 847 calls and texts between them. On the night of Emma's emergency, he made 3 calls to her. The last call lasted 47 minutes. He paused to let this sink in. "Caroline, he saw your 17 calls lighting up his screen. He chose not to answer. He chose to talk to his mistress while your daughter was dying." The words hit Caroline like physical blows. Her husband had watched her desperate calls come in while their daughter coded on an operating table. He had decided his mistress was more important than his dying child. The betrayal was so complete that Caroline could not find words to express what she was feeling. "There's more." Richard pulled out financial documents covered in numbers and highlighted figures. "For the past 4 years, Derek has been systematically embezzling money from his clients and from my foundation. The total is approximately $3.4 million. He's been funneling it through shell companies to pay gambling debts and fund his relationship with Natalie, the apartment where she lives. He bought it with stolen money. The car she drives also stolen." Caroline stared at the documents. Her husband was not just an adulterer. He was a thief. He had stolen from her father's foundation, built to honor her mother's memory. He had stolen from sick children to buy jewelry for his mistress. "The foundation I built in your mother's memory," Richard said, his voice cracking for the first time. "He's been stealing from dying children while pretending to be the devoted husband. Tears formed in her father's eyes. I trusted him. I welcomed him into our family, and he betrayed everything your mother stood for. Richard reached into the folder again. 6 months ago, Derek changed Emma's health insurance policy without telling you. He downgraded her coverage from comprehensive to basic. The emergency room bills from her allergic reaction, $340,000 that insurance won't cover. He met her eyes with barely controlled fury. He knew about her allergies. He chose to risk your daughter's life to free up money for Natalie. The room seemed to tilt around Caroline and mine. Derek had not simply neglected Emma that night. He had set the stage months in advance, reducing her medical protection to fund his affair, gambling with their daughter's life as casually as he gambled online. If Emma had died, it would have been partly because Derek decided his mistress was worth more than adequate health care for his child. How do we destroy him? The words came out before Caroline could stop them, cold and hard and certain. Richard opened another drawer, pulling out a second, thicker folder. We don't destroy him directly. We let him destroy himself. And I know exactly how. He spread documents across the table. We have a forensic accountant tracing every stolen dollar. We have investigators documenting his ongoing affair. We have victims willing to testify. He looked at his daughter with fierce determination. But our most powerful weapon will be a post-nuptial agreement. If we do this correctly, Derek will sign away his marriage with his own hand, believing he's outsmarted everyone. Caroline listened as her father outlined the strategy. Legal proceedings on multiple fronts, criminal referrals to the FBI for wire fraud and embezzlement, civil suits on behalf of the victims. The naive woman who had entered this study was dying with each revelation. A new Caroline was being born in her place, one forged in the fire of betrayal. There are risks, Richard warned. Victoria Mercer has resources and connections throughout Boston. If she discovers what we're doing before we're ready, she'll move to protect her son at any cost. He met Caroline's eyes. But we have something she doesn't expect. We have the truth, and we have a mother who will do anything to protect her daughter. Caroline stood, looking at the evidence documenting her husband's betrayal. 8 years of marriage. 8 years of lies. She thought of Emma's hospital bracelet, still on her nightstand. She thought of the 47 seconds when her daughter's heart had stopped while Derek whispered to his mistress. When do we start? She asked. Richard smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was the smile of a predator given permission to hunt. We already have. The team is assembled. All we need is your commitment to see this through. I'm committed, Caroline said. Whatever it takes. He never sees Emma again. The law offices of Crawford and Associates occupied the entire 23rd floor of a gleaming glass tower in Boston's financial district, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of a city that had no idea what storms were gathering in its midst. Caroline sat at the head of a long mahogany conference table, flanked by her father and surrounded by an impressive array of professionals who had been assembled for the sole purpose of dismantling her husband's carefully constructed empire of lies. Attorney Thomas Crawford presided over the gathering with the quiet authority of a man who had spent 40 years winning cases that other lawyers deemed impossible to prosecute. His silver hair and weathered face projected absolute competence and something more, a genuine appetite for justice that transcended mere professional obligation. Allow me to introduce the team we've assembled, Thomas began, gesturing toward the individuals seated around the polished table. Margaret Foster is our forensic accountant, with 25 years of experience tracing financial crimes through the most sophisticated concealment schemes imaginable. She has served as an expert witness in over 200 federal cases and has never failed to unravel a money trail, no matter how carefully it was hidden. A woman in her 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and reading glasses perched on her nose nodded in acknowledgement of the introduction. Victor Reynolds is our lead investigator, having spent 20 years with the FBI's white-collar crime division before transitioning to private practice. There is no one better equipped to gather the evidence we need. A tall man with the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement inclined his head in greeting. Margaret Foster spoke first, spreading a complex array of financial documents across the conference table with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual hundreds of times throughout her distinguished career. What we've uncovered in our preliminary investigation goes far beyond simple, opportunistic theft, she explained, pointing to a detailed flowchart that traced money through multiple accounts and shell companies across 4 different countries. This is systematic, Premeditated fraud conducted over a period of at least 4 years with considerable sophistication. Your husband created an intricate network of offshore accounts in dummy corporations specifically designed to hide the movement of stolen funds from any routine audit or investigation. The level of planning and financial knowledge involved strongly suggests he had assistance from someone with expertise in money laundering and international banking. Victor Reynolds picked up the narrative thread, opening a thick folder filled with photographs and detailed surveillance reports. Our investigation has identified 3 primary victims beyond the charitable foundation, he said, laying out individual profiles with the clinical detachment of a seasoned investigator who had witnessed every form of human cruelty. The first is Jennifer Walsh, a 67-year-old widow whose husband died of pancreatic cancer 3 years ago. He left her a retirement account containing $2.3 million, the product of an entire lifetime of careful saving and prudent investment. Every penny of that money is now gone. Derek convinced this grieving woman to let him manage her late husband's legacy, presented himself as a trustworthy family friend who would protect her financial security, and then systematically drained her account through a series of completely fraudulent investments that existed only on paper. Mrs. Walsh is currently working part-time at a grocery store to pay her basic living expenses. Caroline studied the photograph of Jennifer Walsh and felt something twist painfully in her chest. The woman had kind eyes and softly graying hair, and the sort of gentle face that suggested she had spent her entire life believing the best about the people around her. Derek had identified that trusting nature as a vulnerability to exploit, had targeted this lonely widow in her moment of greatest grief, and had stripped away everything her dying husband had worked decades to provide. The calculated cruelty of the scheme was almost incomprehensible to Carolina's mind, which still wanted to believe she had married a fundamentally decent person who had simply lost his way. The second victim is Robert Mitchell, Victor continued, pulling out another detailed profile from his organized files. He was a junior analyst at Whitmore and Associates who stumbled upon irregularities in Derek's accounts approximately 2 years ago. When Robert attempted to report his concerns through proper channels, Derek moved swiftly to destroy him. He accused Robert of theft, fabricated evidence of misconduct, and orchestrated his termination from the company, but the character assassination didn't stop there. Derek spread rumors throughout Boston's tight-knit financial community that Robert was mentally unstable and had been embezzling client funds. Robert's professional reputation was completely destroyed. He spent 2 years unemployed, unable to find work in his chosen field because everywhere he applied, the reference check came back contaminated by Derek's lies. He eventually found employment in an entirely different industry, but his career in finance is permanently over. Thomas Crawford leaned forward with the gravity of a man about to deliver particularly difficult information. Now we come to the most deeply troubling discovery of our investigation, he said slowly, clearly preparing Caroline for revelations that would strike even closer to home than what had come before. 6 months ago, Derek made significant changes to your family's insurance policies. He downgraded Emma's health coverage from comprehensive to basic, as you already know, but there's more. He pulled out a stack of official documents bearing insurance company letterheads. He also substantially increased the life insurance policies on both you and Emma. You are now insured for $5 million, and Emma is insured for $2 million. The sole beneficiary listed on both policies is Derek himself, and most damningly, he made all of these changes using forged power of attorney documents that bear your signature but were never actually signed by you. The room fell into heavy silence as the horrific implications of these revelations settled over everyone present. Derek had not merely been unfaithful or dishonest about money. He had been actively plotting scenarios in which he might profit financially from the deaths of his wife and daughter, the insurance increases, the forged documents, the deliberate reduction of Emma's medical coverage. All of these pieces assembled into a picture of premeditated evil that belonged in a crime thriller rather than Caroline's actual life. Richard spoke for this first time since the meeting began, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. Derek has been planning this elaborate escape for years. The affair, the embezzlement, the insurance manipulations, they're all interconnected pieces of the same scheme. He was systematically building resources for a new life with his mistress while simultaneously creating conditions that would allow him to extract maximum value from his current family, whether through divorce, abandonment, or something far worse. Thomas Crawford outlined the legal strategy they intended to pursue. We can proceed against Derek on multiple fronts simultaneously. Civil lawsuits for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty on behalf of the victims whose money he stole, criminal referrals to the FBI for wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering, family court proceedings for divorce with comprehensive documentation of his misconduct. But perhaps our most powerful weapon will be the post-nuptial agreement I'm going to help you convince him to sign. If we execute this correctly, he'll walk directly into a trap of his own making, believing he's outsmarted everyone around him. Caroline listened to the intricate plan unfold and felt herself transforming with each new piece of information. The naive, trusting woman who had entered this conference room was still reeling from shock and betrayal. The woman who would eventually walk out had found a mission and a purpose. Derek had spent years believing he was the smartest person in every room he entered. He was about to discover just how catastrophically wrong that arrogant assumption had been. The restaurant Derek had selected for their 8th anniversary dinner was exactly the kind of establishment he loved to be seen frequenting. Crystal chandeliers cast flattering light across pristine white tablecloths, and waiters in formal attire moved between tables with the practiced grace of professional dancers. Carolyn sat across from her husband and privately marveled at her own performance, at the seemingly effortless ability she had discovered within herself to smile and laugh and pretend that everything was completely normal, while internally counting down the minutes until his destruction began in earnest. Derek had arrived bearing roses and a velvet jewelry box containing diamond earrings that Caroline knew with absolute certainty had been purchased with money stolen from Jennifer Walsh's retirement account. 8 years, Derek said, raising his crystal wine glass in a toast that would have seemed romantic to anyone watching from nearby tables. 8 wonderful years of marriage to the most beautiful woman in Boston. I am the luckiest man alive. His smile was brilliant and utterly convincing, the expression of a man deeply and genuinely in love with his wife. Carolyn clinked her glass against his and wondered how many times he had smiled at Natalie Blackwell in exactly this way. How many romantic dinners he had shared with his mistress in restaurants just like this one, while Caroline stayed home alone with their daughter. Between the appetizer course and the main dish, Caroline carefully steered the conversation toward the topics she had been meticulously preparing for days. I've been thinking a lot about our financial situation lately, she said with studied casualness, sipping her wine as if the words were spontaneous rather than rehearsed. With Emma's hospital bills mounting up and the economy being so uncertain these days, I'm worried that we're not adequately protected against the unexpected. My father actually suggested that we should consider updating our estate planning documents to make sure everything is properly in order. She watched Derek's face with careful attention, noting the slight flicker of concern that passed through his eyes before being smoothly replaced by attentive interest. That's actually a really great idea, Derek said, leaning back in his chair with the studied casualness of a man who believes himself to be several moves ahead of everyone around him. I've been meaning to bring up something similar myself. We should definitely schedule a meeting with Thomas Crawford and review all of our documentation. The exquisite irony of Derek enthusiastically suggesting they consult with the very attorney who was actively building a criminal case against him was almost too perfect to believe. The following week found them seated in Thomas Crawford's office, surrounded by the mahogany furniture and leather-bound law books that projected an atmosphere of trustworthy professionalism. Thomas played his assigned role with consummate skill, presenting himself as nothing more than a trusted family attorney conducting routine legal business rather than a co-conspirator in the elaborate takedown of a financial predator. He presented a thick stack of documents with the dry, somewhat tedious professionalism of someone handling mundane paperwork. Updated wills to reflect their current wishes, revised beneficiary designations for various accounts, and buried strategically in the middle of the pile, a post-nuptial agreement containing clauses that Derek clearly did not bother to examine closely. These are all standard protections for families at your wealth and asset level, Thomas explained, his voice deliberately monotonous to discourage careful attention. The post-nuptial amendment simply clarifies the distribution of assets in various hypothetical scenarios: medical incapacity, death, divorce, the usual contingencies that responsible estate planning addresses. Derek skimmed through the dense legal pages with the glazed, impatient expression of someone who considered such mundane details beneath his superior intelligence. He reached for an expensive pen without asking a single question, too supremely confident in his own cleverness to imagine for even a moment that he might be walking blindly into an elaborately constructed trap. A fidelity clause, Derek laughed with genuine amusement when his eyes briefly caught that particular section heading. You're seriously asking me to promise in writing to be faithful to my wife. That's actually kind of adorable. Carolyn quit. Fine, fine, though whatever makes you feel more secure in our relationship. He signed the document with a flourish, completely missing the critical detail buried in the dense legalese. In the event of proven infidelity by either party, all marital assets would automatically and immediately transfer to the faithful spouse. Full custody of any minor children would be awarded to the wronged party without possibility of contest or appeal. Derek had just signed away his entire marriage with his own confident hand. That evening, celebration at Richard's townhouse, expensive champagne and crystal flutes. He signed everything without reading a single word. Carolyn found herself laughing for the first time in what felt like months. He actually laughed at the fidelity clause and then put his signature right underneath it. Richard raised his glass with the satisfied smile of a chess master watching his opponent walk into an inevitable checkmate. To justice, he said simply, and to the arrogance that will ultimately destroy him. What they did not know, could not have known, was that across the city in a different elegant room, Victoria Mercer was opening a folder of her own. Her loyal housekeeper at the Mercer family home had dutifully reported every detail of Thomas Crawford's visit and the unusual legal documents that had been signed. Victoria was already making phone calls to people who owed her significant favors. Find out exactly what Richard Ashford is planning, she instructed. And more importantly, find me something I can use to stop him. The spring morning that would change everything in Caroline's carefully constructed plans began with an unexpected visitor at her front door. The doorbell rang at precisely 8:30, just after Derek had left for what he claimed was an important breakfast meeting. When Caroline opened the door, she found Victoria Mercer standing on her front steps with an expression that somehow combined complete triumph with barely concealed contempt for everything Caroline represented. "We need to talk," Victoria announced, stepping past Caroline and into the house without waiting for anything resembling an invitation. She moved through the foyer with the proprietary confidence of someone who considered everything in view to be ultimately her property, settling into the most prominent chair in the living room with the practiced grace of a queen ascending her rightful throne. Victoria opened her designer handbag and pulled out a folder that Caroline recognized with an immediate sinking feeling of dread. Photographs, documents, evidence of her father's investigation, somehow obtained and now being wielded as a weapon against her. "You actually thought you could come after my son without facing any consequences," Victoria said, her voice dripping with cold amusement at Carolyn's apparent naivety. "You actually believed your father's faded reputation and outdated connections would be enough to protect you from our family. How touchingly foolish." She pulled out another document from the folder. "This is a report prepared by a private investigator 20 years ago. It documents a case your father prosecuted early in his career. To save a witness's life, your father made the decision to suppress evidence that would have exonerated the defendant. That innocent man served 5 years in federal prison for a crime he did not commit." Caroline felt the solid ground beneath her feet begin to crumble as Victoria outlined the full implications of what she had discovered. "Here's exactly what is going to happen now," Victoria said, her tone becoming businesslike and final. "You are going to drop this investigation immediately and completely. You are going to destroy whatever evidence you have already gathered. You are going to convince your father to abandon his crusade against my son. And you are going to pretend to be a happy, satisfied wife until Derek decides on his own terms that he is ready to end this marriage." She rose from the chair, smoothing her expensive dress with manicured hands. "If you refuse to comply with these requirements, I will release your father's misconduct to every media outlet in Boston. I will file a lawsuit that will drain every penny he possesses in legal fees. And I will make absolutely certain that in any custody dispute, Emma ends up permanently in Derek's care." The drive to her father's house passed in a blur of desperate tears and rising panic. Richard was waiting at the door with an expression that confirmed her worst fears. In the familiar study where she had learned so many terrible truths over the past weeks, Carolyn now learned one more. "It happened 20 years ago," Richard said heavily, staring into the empty fireplace with eyes that seemed focused on distant memories. "I was prosecuting a major case involving organized crime. One of my key witnesses was a young woman who had turned state's evidence against extremely dangerous people. The defense obtained information that would have completely discredited her testimony. But releasing that information would also have revealed her location to men who had already tried to kill her once. He paused, gathering himself. I made an impossible choice. I suppressed the evidence. The defendant went to prison for a crime I wasn't certain he committed, and the witness survived to build a new life under a different name. I have to step back from helping you, Richard finally said, tears streaming openly down his weathered face. If I remain visibly involved, Victoria will use my past mistake to discredit everything we've built. But if I withdraw publicly, if I distance myself from the investigation, perhaps the evidence can still be used without my involvement tainting it in the eyes of a jury. You have the post-nuptial agreement Derek signed. You have all the documentation we've gathered. You can still fight this battle and win it. But you'll have to do it without me standing beside you. That night, alone in the darkness of the house she had shared with her lying husband for 8 years, Carolyn allowed herself to feel the full crushing weight of her despair. But as the hours crawled past and the darkness deepened around her, something remarkable began to happen. The despair that had threatened to consume her started to transform, hardening into something else entirely, something that felt like cold steel being forged in fire. Victoria Mercer believed she had won this battle. Derek believed he was completely safe from consequences. They both assumed that without Richard's backing and resources, Caroline would simply collapse and surrender to their demands. They had absolutely no idea who they were actually dealing with. Caroline pulled out her laptop and began typing with determined fingers, Jennifer Walsh. If she could not fight this war with her father's institutional power and connections, she would fight it with something Victoria and Derek would never expect. The accumulated truth of every single person they had ever destroyed. The coffee shop on Charles Street had been carefully selected for its complete anonymity, a place where tourists and graduate students and neighborhood regulars mixed together without anyone paying particular attention to anyone else. Carolyn sat at a corner table nursing a cup of tea she had no intention of actually drinking, watching the entrance for the woman who represented her first attempt at building an independent alliance. Jennifer Walsh arrived at precisely the agreed-upon time, her gray wool coat modest and noticeably worn, her face bearing the weathered look of someone who had endured far too much hardship in far too short a time. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Carolyn said as Jennifer settled carefully into the seat across from her. "I realize this must seem incredibly strange, receiving a call out of nowhere from Derek Mercer's wife." Jennifer's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession: pain, certainly, and suspicion, but also something that looked remarkably like hope. "When you said on the phone that you wanted to help me understand what he really did, I knew immediately that I had to come. I've been waiting 3 long years for someone to finally believe me." The story Jennifer told over the next hour painted a devastating picture of calculated, patient predation. After her husband's death from cancer, Jennifer had been completely grief-stricken and desperately vulnerable, searching for someone trustworthy to help manage the modest fortune her husband had spent 40 years accumulating for their retirement. Derek had presented himself as exactly that person, so kind, so patient, so understanding of her confusion and overwhelming pain. He had promised to protect her financial future and honor her late husband's memory through careful stewardship. Instead, he had systematically stolen every single penny through a series of completely fraudulent investments that existed only on paper statements he personally fabricated. "I trusted him with everything," Jennifer said, her voice trembling with the memory of that misplaced faith. "He would come to my house and drink tea with me and patiently explain market conditions, and I believed every single word he said. By the time I finally realized what was actually happening, all the money was completely gone. $2.3 million. Everything James worked his entire adult life to build for us." She reached into her worn handbag and pulled out a battered folder. "But I kept everything, every statement, every email, every recording of our phone conversations. I knew somehow, someday, someone would finally want to see the truth." Jennifer's network of contacts proved far more extensive than Caroline had dared to hope. Over the following weeks, she found herself meeting an entire community of people who had been systematically victimized by Derek and then efficiently silenced by Victoria's money and influence. Robert Mitchell, the young analyst whose promising career had been deliberately destroyed when he tried to report the fraud. Sandra Morrison, whose elderly parents had lost their entire life savings to Derek's phantom investment schemes. Thomas Wellington, a former colleague who had been paid substantial hush money to stay quiet but whose guilty conscience had never stopped troubling his sleep. Detective Marcus Sullivan entered Caroline's orbit through a connection Jennifer had cultivated over her years of frustrated attempts to find justice. He was a Boston PD detective with 15 years of distinguished service and a deeply personal vendetta against the Mercer family that ran straight to his core. His former partner had been aggressively investigating Victoria's charitable foundation for financial irregularities when he was suddenly and inexplicably transferred to traffic duty in the outer boroughs. Within 6 months of that transfer, fabricated misconduct charges had forced him out of the department entirely. Victoria Mercer destroyed the career of the best cop I ever worked with, Marcus said during their clandestine meeting on a bench overlooking the Charles River. I've been waiting 5 years for a legitimate opportunity to return that particular favor. He reviewed the evidence Caroline had assembled with the practiced eye of a veteran investigator. This is solid work, really solid. But to bring down someone as connected as Victoria, you're going to need testimony from inside the organization. Someone who can speak to what happened in real time. The breakthrough came from completely unexpected source. Gregory Thornton was the longtime chief financial officer of Whitmore and Associates, Victoria's family company. He was 60 years old, planning to retire quietly at the end of the calendar year, and carrying a burden of accumulated guilt that had grown heavier with every passing month of complicity. He contacted Caroline through an encrypted email service, requesting a meeting at a church parking lot on the outskirts of the city. I've watched that family systematically destroy innocent people for 15 years, Gregory said, his hands visibly shaking as he handed Caroline a flash drive containing years of meticulously maintained records. Every transaction, every cover-up, every payment made to silence victims. It's all documented there. His eyes glistened with unshed tears. I saw the news coverage about your daughter, the emergency room, the hospital stay. I have granddaughters myself. I couldn't stay silent anymore, no matter what it cost me personally. The FBI field office in downtown Boston hummed with the focused energy of an operation steadily approaching its moment of decisive action. Carolyn sat in a secure conference room reviewing documents with Agent Sarah Mitchell and a team of federal prosecutors who had been specially assigned to what was now officially designated Operation Silver Trust. The case file had grown to fill 12 thick binders, each one containing documented evidence sufficient to send Derek and Victoria Mercer to federal prison for decades. We've successfully verified the complete money trail, Agent Mitchell reported, gesturing toward a complex flowchart that covered an entire wall of the conference room. Funds stolen from client accounts in the Ashford Foundation were systematically funneled through 17 separate shell companies across 4 different countries before finally landing in accounts directly controlled by Derek Mercer. Victoria Mercer personally signed authorization for at least 12 of these fraudulent transfers, establishing her direct complicity in the conspiracy. Total estimated losses across all identified victims now exceed $8 million. There's one final piece we need before we can proceed with arrests, Agent Mitchell said. Natalie Blackwell, Derek's mistress. She's been receiving stolen funds through the apartment and car he purchased for her. We could potentially charge her as an accessory to the fraud, but she might prove far more valuable to us as a cooperating witness who can testify to Derek's statements and intentions. Caroline understood immediately what was being asked of her. They wanted her to personally confront the woman who had been sleeping with her husband for 18 months, to sit across from the person who had answered Derek's phone calls while Emma lay dying in an operating room. I'll do it, she said quietly. Tell me where to find her. Natalie's luxury apartment was located in a prestigious Back Bay building, purchased entirely with money Derek had stolen from grieving widows and sick children. The confrontation that followed was one of the most difficult experiences of Caroline's entire life. She watched Natalie's carefully maintained composure crumble as the full truth about Derek's crimes became undeniably clear: the stolen money, the elderly victims, the phone records proving he had been talking to Natalie during the 17 desperate calls Caroline made while Emma was dying. He told me his phone was dead that night, Natalie whispered, staring at the call logs with dawning horror. He told me you were mentally unstable and that he was filing for divorce. He told me all the money came from his family inheritance. She looked up at Caroline with eyes filled with genuine shock. I swear to God, I didn't know any of this was happening. Natalie agreed to cooperate fully with the FBI before Caroline left the apartment. That same evening, Derek casually announced that he had booked a surprise family vacation to Turks and Caicos. 2 weeks in paradise, he said with his charming smile. Caroline felt ice crystallize in her stomach. Turks and Caicos had extremely limited extradition treaties with the United States. Derek was clearly planning to flee the country with Emma before anyone could stop him. She immediately texted Marcus Sullivan with this alarming development. His response came within seconds. We absolutely cannot let him leave the country. If he gets suspicious and accelerates his timeline, we could lose him permanently. The careful timeline they had spent months constructing was suddenly in serious jeopardy. They would have to move much faster than originally planned. The morning of the arrest dawned gray and cold, a February day that seemed specifically designed to match the gravity of what was about to unfold. At precisely 10:15 in the morning, a convoy of FBI vehicles pulled up to the headquarters of Whitmore and Associates in Boston's financial district. Agent Sarah Mitchell led her team through the lobby, past confused security guards and gaping receptionists, into the elevator that would carry them to the executive floor where years of criminal activity were finally about to meet their reckoning. Derek was in a board meeting when the agents arrived, sitting at the head of the polished conference table with the supremely confident posture of a man who genuinely believed himself to be completely untouchable. Victoria occupied the seat to his right, her silver hair perfectly styled, her designer suit immaculate, her face radiating the authority of someone who had never in her entire privileged life faced meaningful consequences for any of her actions. The conference room door burst open without warning or announcement. Agent Mitchell stepped through with her badge held high. Derek Mercer, you are under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Derek's handsome face went pale, then flushed red with disbelief, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. This is absolutely outrageous, Victoria shouted, rising from her chair with the fury of a woman who had never been denied anything she wanted. Do you have any idea who we are? Do you have any concept of the connections our family possesses? I will have your badge for this. I will destroy your entire career. Agent Mitchell's professional expression did not flicker even slightly as she turned to address Derek's mother directly. Victoria Mercer Whitmore, you are also under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and witness tampering. Please place your hands behind your back. The preliminary hearing took place 3 weeks later in a federal courtroom packed with reporters, victims, and curious spectators. Caroline sat in the front row of the gallery, wearing a simple black dress and Emma's hospital bracelet as a talisman of everything she had fought to protect. When her turn came to deliver a victim impact statement, Caroline walked to the witness stand with steady legs and held up Emma's hospital bracelet for the entire courtroom to see. On the night of December 3rd, my 6-year-old daughter had a severe allergic reaction. Her heart stopped beating for 47 seconds while doctors fought desperately to save her life. During those 47 seconds, I called my husband 17 times. He didn't answer a single call because he was lying in bed with his mistress. She paused to let the words settle over the silent courtroom. But that's not even the worst part of what he did. 6 months before that terrible night, Derek secretly changed Emma's health insurance without my knowledge or consent. He deliberately reduced her coverage to free up more money for his girlfriend and his gambling addiction. He knew about Emma's severe allergies. He understood exactly what he was risking, and he decided that his affair was worth gambling with his own daughter's life. She looked directly at Derek, who sat pale and diminished at the defense table. My daughter whispered, "Tell Daddy I love him," right before they took her into surgery. She almost died while still loving you with her whole innocent heart, and you weren't worth a single second of that precious love. Carolyn's voice grew stronger, filled with cold certainty. But here's what you never counted on. Derek, I'm not the naive, trusting woman you married anymore. That woman would have forgiven you eventually. That woman would have protected your reputation for Emma's sake. That woman died on the night you let our daughter's heart stop beating. And the woman standing here in this courtroom today, she's the one who buried you. The judge announced sufficient evidence to proceed to trial on all counts. Then, as Victoria was being escorted from the courtroom, a federal marshal approached with an additional arrest warrant. The ongoing investigation had uncovered even more crimes. Victoria Mercer Whitmore was not merely an accessory to her son's schemes. She was a criminal enterprise unto herself. 6 months had passed since the arrest that shattered the Mercer family's decades of carefully cultivated respectability. Spring had softened into summer. Summer had blazed into fall. And now the first hints of winter were returning to Boston with their familiar chill. Caroline stood in the butterfly garden that now bore her daughter's name, watching Emma chase monarchs through the carefully cultivated flowers, while other children from the hospital recovery program joined in the gentle, joyful chaos of childhood at play. The trials had concluded 2 months earlier with convictions on nearly every count the prosecutors had brought. Derek received 15 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for at least 10 years, followed by an additional 8 years in state prison for insurance fraud and document forgery. Victoria received 12 years for her extensive role in the conspiracy, along with complete seizure of the family assets that had funded generations of Mercer entitlement and corruption. Whitmore and Associates had been permanently dissolved. Jennifer Walsh had recovered most of her stolen money through the court-ordered restitution process and had used a portion of it to establish a scholarship fund in her late husband's name. Robert Mitchell had been hired by the FBI as a consultant on financial fraud cases, his expertise finally being used for legitimate good. Gregory Thornton had passed away peacefully in September, surrounded by his loving family and secure in the knowledge that his final act on earth had been one of genuine courage. The butterfly garden had been Emma's own idea. Conceived during a therapy session when the counselor asked her to draw something that would make her feel genuinely happy. She had created a picture filled with colorful butterflies and bright flowers and explained that she wanted to build a special place where sick children could go to feel better, even just for a little while. Carolyn had made that dream into reality, working with the hospital administration and the restructured Ashford Foundation to transform a neglected courtyard into a sanctuary of color and life and hope. "Mommy, look," Emma called out excitedly, running toward Caroline with small hands cupped carefully together. Inside sat a fat green caterpillar, completely unconcerned with all the excitement it was generating. "Can we keep it? Please, I want to watch it become a butterfly." Carolyn knelt down to examine the small creature, remembering another conversation about transformation and becoming what you were always meant to be. "We can take it home with us," she agreed. "We'll put it in a jar with some leaves and watch together what happens next." Richard appeared at the garden's entrance, carrying cups of hot cocoa from the cafe down the street. They found a sunny bench in a quiet corner of the garden and sat together, 3 generations of Ashfords watching butterflies dance among the flowers in the garden, named for the youngest among them. "I'm proud of you," Richard said quietly while Emma ran off to explore. "What you accomplished, how you handled everything when it mattered most. Your mother would have been so proud of the woman you've become." Carolyn felt the familiar ache that always accompanied thoughts of her mother. "I had help along the way. I had people who believed in me when I wasn't sure I believed in myself anymore." That night, after Emma was finally asleep with her caterpillar jar resting on the nightstand beside her bed, Caroline sat by the window of their new home watching the city lights flicker in the distance like earthbound stars. She thought about everyone who had helped her survive and ultimately triumph. Jennifer and all the other victims who trusted her with their painful stories. Marcus and the FBI agents who believed in building the case. Gregory, who found the courage to do the right thing at the very end of his life. Her father, whose love had never wavered even when his own past threatened to destroy everything they had built together. The hospital bracelet sat on her nightstand now, a permanent reminder of the night that had changed everything. Carolyn picked it up gently and traced Emma's name with her finger, remembering the terror and the desperate hope and the long months of determined fighting that had followed that terrible December night. "My name is Caroline Ashford," she whispered softly to the quiet room. "I was a victim of betrayal. Then I became a warrior fighting for justice. And now I'm simply a mother, doing my best to raise my daughter in a world that can be unimaginably cruel, but is also filled with unexpected beauty and hope and second chances." She set down the bracelet and looked out at the stars visible between the city buildings. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to grow. But tonight she was finally at peace. The long war was over. Justice had been served. And whatever came next in her life, Carolyn knew she would face it with the strength she had discovered within herself. Strength that had always been there, waiting patiently for the moment when it was truly needed. The butterfly was finally ready to fly.